Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well. So this is the second video of the PlaneMaker tutorial series, and in this video all we're going to talk about is how to make a fuselage in PlaneMaker. This is probably one of the trickiest things to do in PlaneMaker, so just bear with me here, but I hope I can do it justice. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go back to the X-Plane system folder that we talked about earlier, and we're not going to go to our aircraft folder in here, but rather we're just going to open PlaneMaker. If you want, you can pin it to your taskbar. That's what I do because I use this a lot. And if you did not open another aircraft after you created this kind of basic tube last time, it should just open up right back to that. Now, this gray tube here that you see is your basic fuselage. And right now it doesn't look like that much, and it's kind of partially invisible because of how thin it is and because it's completely open. And so right now it's not very exciting. One thing you should be aware of is that if you press your spacebar and see a wireframe view, this is kind of helpful for fuselage because you can see if you have a point that's kind of out of alignment, you can figure out where it is fairly quickly. So, to edit the fuselage, what we're going to do is we're going to go to Standard, and then obviously Fuselage. And now, this kind of editor view is one that you'll kind of see in a couple different places in PlaneMaker as you progress. So, it's a good idea that you know how it works, and I'm going to do my best to describe what everything does, but I may miss some things, so yeah, here we go. So the first thing you'll notice is that there are 3 tabs up here. There's a checkbox and then these 2 buttons. These tabs switch your view of your fuselage. This is a really handy thing for if you make a change in here, you want to see how it looks without Xing out. Just switch over to this tab, you can see what it looks like. You can do the same for the front and back views. Very handy. Now, if you're making a flying wing, that's the only reason why you'd really uncheck this box. Most planes have a fuselage, few don't, so unless that's what you're going for, I would recommend leaving that checked. And now, these 2 buttons right here allow you to import the fuselages of other aircraft and also weapon files. For the purposes of this class, you're not really going to ever need to do that, and in some cases we're going to encourage you to not do that, so I wouldn't worry about those if I were you. Now, the 2 important bits that you really need to know how to use are this body data section and the cross-section section. We don't really need to do anything here because this is it's kind of pointless, because if you offset your fuselage, that kind of throws off your preference point for positioning other things later. So I wouldn't change anything here unless you really specifically need to. And then body texture, most of you won't be using textures for your aircraft, and this isn't really the best way to position texture regions, so I wouldn't worry about this either. So we're just going to focus on body data and cross sections. So first, let's talk about what these cross-sections are and what their various bits are. So, as you can see, we have these cross-sections of our aircraft, and if you notice, when we go back here and press that wireframe view key, you'll notice that each cross-section corresponds to one part of this wireframe. So, you can individually manipulate points of each cross-section, which we'll get into later, but that's kind of what they do and how they work. So you can adjust the number of cross-sections you have with this box up here called number of stations. The minimum value is 3, the most you can have is 20, but you only get to see, I think, about a bit more than half of them per screen. So once you've maxed out your number of cross-sections, you can use this button over here and this button over here to kind of cycle through them. So this kind of goes over to the last ones, and then you can go back to the first ones. So the next thing is number of radii per side. So a radii is a single point on your cross-section. You can get away with having as few as 5 and still have a somewhat okay looking fuselage, but as you can see there, it really lowers the amount of points that you can mess with. So I would keep this at the maximum of 9. And so now you see that all this is kind of ruined, and it seems like that's rather unfortunate, but thankfully there's a handy way around this, which I forgot to mention in the first video. PlaneMaker actually does have an undo and redo button, and it's not Control-Z you press, it's just Z. Although I don't know if it works in this specific instance. Okay, never mind then. Alright, so let's get into manipulating these cross-sections. So I'm just going to go back to having 10 just because that's a reasonable number to work with for this tutorial. You can add more later, but once you figure out what these do, it's pretty obvious to find out whether you need more or less. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is on my very first cross-section and on my very last one. I don't want these to be open because that'll make my plane look disgusting and negatively impact its aerodynamics. So I'm just going to click anywhere in this region here, and then now you can see that's reduced to a single point. And I'm going to do the same over here. So this is a good way to show you kind of what you can do with these points. So the points are fairly simple to manipulate, unless they're on the edge of your box here. You can just drag them around however you want. So like that. So now I'm just going to try to reconstruct the circle so I can just kind of show you what this would look like if you weren't messing it up. So you just kind of drag each point where you want it to be. And now you can see I've got this disgusting looking mess of a fuselage here. So another way you can position these is you can use these boxes over here. So the bottom box positions your point on the vertical axis in fractions of your radius. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. This is an important part, the body radius. So this is the radius of your fuselage. The bigger this number is, the more room you have to work with when you're making your cross sections. For most general aviation aircraft, I would use maybe somewhere between 2 and 3 feet of radius. For a fighter, you might want a bit more, and then for a wide-body airliner, you might want as high as like 10 feet or more. So let's just go with 2 feet for now. So as you can see, as I move these points around, their positional values in these two boxes change. So this box here allows you to manipulate where your individual points are on the lateral axis away from the longitudinal axis of your plane, which is a line that runs through, like straight through all these cross sections at this point right here. And then you can manipulate these points on the vertical again. So this is really useful for if you want to like kind of finely manipulate stuff, or if you want to carefully move an entire cross section down a bit. So to do that, you just select each point, and then you select a point by clicking near it once, which is important because there's a very important distinction between single clicking a point and double clicking. So once you have a point selected, you'll notice that these values change to indicate the position of your point. And so you can raise and lower that however you like to fit the shape of the aircraft you want. So another really handy thing you can do with this editor, just kind of as a basic thing, is if you want to make a circle or an ellipse of some sort, you can do that by locking a set of 3 points and then forcing the rest to be kind of calculated into an ellipse shape around those two. So if I wanted to get my circle back, I would drag this point or move it. I would move this point here down to the maximum over here. I would center this point on the vertical and just kind of max it out over here. And then this is a crucial bit. So if you double click by a point, that locks it. It's kind of hard to see, so I'll move this one over here, but it turns it from an open point into a filled-in square. So once you have a point locked, you can just kind of click in the box, or you can double click outside of it. And when your point is filled in, that means it's locked. So if you want to make an ellipse, generally what you want to do is you want to get the bottommost and the uppermost point, and then the middle point. So since I've got 9, that would be the point that's 4 sections away from the endpoints. And once you have that, if I move this point in here, now I've got this terrible looking shape, but if you press the ellipse button a few times to smooth it out, it kind of automatically gives you this nice smooth ellipse shape. But that's not what I want. I want a round circle. So I'm going to move that all the way out to the end in this direction, and no offset on the vertical. And then I'm just going to give it a couple presses of the ellipse button. So that's kind of the basic manipulations you can do on individual cross-sections of the fuselage. And the tricky thing about this is that when you're trying to model a specific aircraft, it's kind of hard to get it shaped exactly right just by using this editor. And there aren't really a ton of ways around that. You kind of just have to eyeball things. So that's the main downside of this. So basically, to make an aircraft, what you want to do is you want to maybe either picture it in your head, maybe kind of sketch it out on a piece of paper to kind of get an idea of what the shape of your fuselage is going to look like, and then either mentally or like with a pencil, just slice it up into a number of sections, and then kind of try to guess what the shape of that section would look like, and then just try your very best to model that in this editor here. So if I was making a fighter, let's say, I would want to have a pretty pointy nose for decent supersonic aerodynamics. So I'd just make a circle here. And then I'd want the rest of my fuselage to be roughly circle base so I can manipulate it later. And there are two ways to do this. One, you can just kind of flip over the geometry of one station onto another by using this button here. So you press the one on the right, it'll copy it over to the one immediately to the right of it. And if you do the one on the left, I'm just going to use this as an example. You can see now this has the geometry of this one. If you don't want to do it that way, you can also copy the geometry of one section here by clicking copy. You can paste it over here. I just do this because it's quicker. Now you can see if I go back here, I've got this kind of stubby cylindrical shape going on. So this is pretty short fuselage, only about 9 feet long. To make it longer, what you want to do is you want to change these values here. So these values are the position of each section of your fuselage on the longitudinal axis. So if I wanted to make a fighter that was about 50 feet long, which is a pretty normal size for a fighter, I'd move my last point to about 50 feet here. And now you can see this point's all the way out here, this one's over here, and X-plane interpolates what the wireframe is going to do in between. And in case you haven't noticed, that isn't really what a plane looks like. So I'm just going to move this point kind of close to being back there. And now I'm realizing that, you know what, this plane is kind of long and skinny, because a fighter is a relatively large aircraft. I'm just going to make my body radius a bit bigger. Now it's 3 feet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the kind of a circle in the middle here. I'm just going to center this. I'm going to lock each point that I want to use as a reference for my ellipse. Now I've got a nice little circle. And I'm going to make this a pretty simple design for my fuselage, just for simplicity's sake. So I'm just going to have it be circular all the way back. But now you can see we've got a whole bunch of stuff over here and not very much over here. And eventually you might want to have more to work with in the middle of your fuselage if you want to use what's called the area rule, which is a method of reducing transonic wave drag that we can talk about later. So you just kind of want to spread out these points. If you have 10, maybe do one every 10 feet or so. It's not a super big deal. So you really want to concentrate your sections where you want to have a lot more control over your aircraft geometry. So I'm maybe going to make one at like 15 feet here, and then now I have a whole bunch more to work with to get the shape of my nose better. And so to do that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say, we'll put this at 8 feet. To do this, what you're going to want to do is so you take one section here, and then the next one over, which I'll say it's going to be at 4 feet, I'm going to lock these outermost points. I'm going to select this one, and I'm just going to scooch it down to maybe 2.5. I'm going to do the same to this point, same to this one, and then I'm going to press that ellipse button, and now I'm starting to get a kind of smoother curve here. This one's already okay. Now we're going to take this one, just going to maybe bring that down to 1.5 or so. It's not terribly important to be super consistent in terms of like fractional values of how much you're changing this, but definitely makes it easier to position them later. So now I've got, this kind of actually is starting to look a bit more like a plane, but if I really want this to have a nice pointy nose, I need to adjust my spacing a bit. So this is going to need to be farther back so that X-plane can have a shallower angle between the center point and that section. So I'm just going to move all of these back a bit. So now that one's there. This one can maybe be here. And it's kind of tricky to judge how it's going to go, so in many cases it's just going to be kind of trial and error. And I'm just going to admit I'm not really super great at making fuselages. I usually try to just make one good one, and then I try to kind of derive other shapes from it. So I would just import ones that I make previously, because I'm quite lazy when it comes to making aircraft. And that's beside the point. So anyways, just kind of getting that reasonably shaped. So now we've got a somewhat pointy-ish nose and a relatively aerodynamic looking body. And that's about all you need to do to make a simple fuselage. Again, it's not really... It's kind of tricky to get exactly the shape you want. And X-Plane's aerodynamic model is pretty good, but it's not absolutely accurate, so it's not a super big deal if you're a little bit off from the exact shape that you want or the exact shape of the aircraft you're trying to model. So just kind of try and get it as close as you can. So once you have your basic fuselage all set up, what you can do... Oh, forgot to mention. Another useful thing. If you want to give yourself more sections in between others, you can press Insert, and you get another one at the same position of the one immediately to the left of it. This isn't super useful because once you've made one, there's no really good way to get it to go away. So you just kind of have to position it where you want. Now I've got another section in there. So yeah, that's about that. So that's kind of how you make a basic fuselage. If you've ended up with a really funky design with lots of jagged edges, there are two things you can do to save yourself a little bit. If you've so if you've made some changes in sorry, I forgot to talk about this part. This is kind of important. So if you want to kind of make a cockpit sort of shape, you can modify points in here as well. This is kind of useful if you want to smooth things out a bit or give yourself a bit more detail. So if I wanted to make a cockpit sort of shape, I can just kind of raise up this here, over here, maybe. It kind of looks like a cockpit. This isn't really the only way you can do this. We'll talk more about that later. But this is a way to let X-Plane aerodynamically kind of evaluate the performance of your aircraft a little bit better. Again, not required. So if you've done some editing in here and you're not quite pleased with how it's turned out, like maybe you've got a funky looking shape like this, maybe you've crossed some wires. This is a thing you never really want to do. Don't cross the wires. If you've done that, you can so just select a point in the section you're working on, and then you can say reset this section to vertical. And now you can see suddenly, poof, it's back to being only vertically manipulated without having points manipulated in the longitudinal axis. If you've really messed up like your entire fuselage, you can reset all of your points to vertical. I wouldn't really recommend doing that unless you've really, really, really messed things up, because otherwise it'll just get rid of all the other work you've done to kind of get shapes properly shaped. And then over here in front and back you can also edit points the same way, just by dragging them around. Gives you a little better visualization. And I think that should be about it for that. So now, last thing you can do to kind of smooth things out a bit is in the special tab, you can smooth your entire fuselage, and you can ellipse smooth your entire fuselage. Now, press F1 and F6. You can see things are kind of starting to get smoothed out. Again, this isn't something you really necessarily need to do unless you really mess things up. I never really do it, but your mileage may vary, so just see what that does for you. Now what I just did there is I made my final point be a bit in compared to the furthest section away from the front of the aircraft. This is something you can do. You can offset these sections to basically wherever you want, and PlaneMaker won't try to stop you. But don't really do it if you've got a difference in the shape of your sections, because then you end up with really kind of funky looking shapes like that, which you might not want. And I'm just going to fix that, get that back to normal. So that's how you create a basic fuselage. I hope you found this helpful. Like I said, this isn't really the easiest part of PlaneMaker. In fact, it's probably the hardest part. But once you've got something decent, what I recommend you do is practice a couple times, maybe model the fuselage of an aircraft that exists in the real world. Just try to see how close you can get it by doing that. And I'm not going to lie when I say that this is pretty tricky to get the hang of. But like all things that are tricky, the best way to get better is just to practice it. So that's about all I've got for fuselages. Hope you found this helpful. If you didn't, you should be able to come to office hours where Jason and I can help you out with some of this stuff. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.